Hello, I'm Sally Wiener Grotta, and this is What If, Why Not, How? Where I ask people who have interesting stories and ideas questions that are on my mind. Hello, today my guest is Nola Saint James. Nola is a Regency romance author, and she began reading romance novels to get a break from her real life job, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. She realized that an hour curled up in a comfy chair with a well-written book was the best stress reliever in the world. And I couldn't agree with you more on that one. And you have the perfect sofa behind you to relax on.
I love that sofa. It's been in the family for centuries.
And then she especially likes it if good vanquishes evil and the main characters always get their happily ever after. I sometimes love that too, and sometimes I like the uncertainty, but that's my taste. But I can appreciate what a relief it is when you care about a character for them to get their happily ever after. One night, she tells me, she had a dream in which a raven turned into a handsome man. She woke up, went to her computer, and quickly wrote the outline for the first of her Ravencroft Chronicles series, The Curse of the Ravencroft Brides. She's been writing Regency romances ever since. Her two newest books are Anarchy at Almec, that's Rowan's story, a story of love at first sight, and that was published just this past April. And the newest is Midnight Miracle, a Regency Christmas romantasy, which was released just this August. So we're going to get a really new view into a new book. Nola Saint James is a native New Yorker with a parallel life. And we're not going to be mysterious about it anymore because it's in that parallel life that I first met Nola as Rabbi Jo David. Welcome, Nola and Joe. I'm delighted to have you here with me today.
Thank you so much, Sally. It's just delightful to be here, and I'm always happy to talk about my books and my journey, because becoming a novelist is something that I've wanted to do since I was 3 years old.
Oh my!
And I did. There's a picture. I have it up on my right next to my desk of myself as at a Remington typewriter at the age of 3. And I keep it there to remind myself that things may not work out exactly in the way we think they should.
Yeah.
They don't always look like what we think they will look like, but if we put one foot in front of the other, very often we get to where we want to be. May not be when we think it should be or how it's going to look, but we get there. And I'm in as my husband says, in my third quarter, because right in Judaism we say till 120, so I'm in my third quarter. Not as my creative partner says in our fourth quarter. He's not Jewish, so he thinks about the world as 100 years. I don't. That's ridiculous.
No.
So
that's absurd.
we're the same age, but we exist in different time frames.
Yes, that's
Anyway,
interesting.
It's so wonderful at this time of my life when most people are either retiring or they're paying or they're not working, to be starting a new career, a new business. My first book that you mentioned, my first published book, Anarchy at Almax, got published because we were waiting to hear from an agent.
Oh.
And it was just about in August of last year. We sent in a whole presentation, the first 2 Ravenscroft novels, and we were waiting, and we were sure that this person would come and say yes because it was someone that my partner knew, my creative partner knew. And every time the phone would ring, he was the contact, I would think, oh, he's calling to tell me either yes, she wants us, or no, the dream is over. And that went on for about 3 months, and we were both becoming insane.
Mhm.
I didn't know, should I continue writing? Is my writing
Aw.
Jim Gaynor, my creative partner, had encouraged me to continue to write. He was an editor at Grosset and Dunlap when I had first shown him about 5 years ago the manuscript for Curse of the Ravensbrook Brides. Even though we'd known each other over 30 years, he didn't know that I was writing these. It was a very deep secret. And he read it and he said, this is publishable. This is good. And I thought he was really the first one to give me that kind of support. I've been a writer professionally all my life. I've had several nonfiction books published. I'm a full member of the Authors Guild. And as a rabbi, and before that in public relations and marketing, I was a writer. So I was always writing, but I always wanted to write novels. And somehow I could never do it, or there wasn't time, or all these things that just the stars weren't in alignment. And so I'd finally done it, and I'd written Anarchy, and we decided to go with Anarchy. And Jim finally said, we should just publish this ourselves.
Oh.
And I thought, I wanted to know that a real agent believed in me. That was very important to me.
It is. Yes.
And actually, my other books that I've published have been traditionally published through several different publishers. So it wasn't that I didn't have the experience of having, and I even had an agent at one point who was trying to sell Curse of the Ravensbrook Bride when I first wrote it. And she couldn't get it, and I didn't know what was wrong, and she couldn't tell me. It was very disappointing. But I thought, that's how I'm going to become famous, right? Because we always think of, right, it sells and you become J.K. Rowling.
Right.
I didn't
if only.
But it felt like if an agent doesn't pick you up, and if it's not published by one of, now there are only 5 publishers.
Yeah.
And if
of the traditional ones,
of the traditional publishers, right? And I thought, well, it can't be, what if it's not good enough? That means it's not good enough. And Jim, who had started a press to publish his poetry, because if getting novels published is hard,
that's impossible. Poetry's.
So, yes. But he wanted his books, he wanted his poetry in print for his grandson. And so he started a little press for himself, and he had this great designer and some other people who worked with him. And he said, well, let's let Nemeton publish it. We'll work on it. Nemeton Press was the name of his press. And we'll get it out there. And meanwhile, we'll see what happens. We didn't publish Curse of the Ravensbrook Brides because it was still with the publisher. We didn't, the agent, we didn't want to screw that up. So I had meanwhile wrote this other book, which was shorter novel. And because if we were going to publish it and pay for it ourselves, it was cheaper to do it if it was 50,000 words than if it was 100,000 words, like the Ravensbrook.
That is a short novel, yes.
Yeah. But actually in romance today, it's about this 40 to 50,000 words about the length of novels today, of romance novels.
Okay. I didn't know that. Well, what I would love to do is for us to have a taste of one of your novels. Yeah, and you prepared a reading for us from Midnight Miracle, was it?
Yes, Midnight Miracle just came out, even though on Amazon it says that it was published on April 5th. I just got the proof copy last week,
Oh,
and it is now up on Amazon. The Kindle will be up in about a week or so, and the Kindle in Spanish will be up
wow.
in about a week or so. We decided we got a lot of requests when Anarchy came out for a Spanish Kindle version.
Fabulous.
So we thought,
Why not?
not. So let me tell you a little bit about Midnight Miracle.
Please do.
It's, first of all, it's important to say that this is a G-rated romance. There is a rating system, informal rating system for romances, and it has to do with how the sex is handled.
Mm-hmm.
And anything that is considered a sweet romance means that there's going to be a kiss, probably at the end, and anyone from 13 to 130 can read it without being embarrassed. So this is, because it was meant to be a holiday book, I thought it would be nice to make it for people, for everyone to be able to read. It's based on the Norwegian legend that at midnight of Christmas Eve, animals can talk in the language of humans. And in this book, the heroine, who is a 17-year-old orphan, is trying to find her true love because her evil trustees are trying to marry her off to someone so that they can steal her inheritance. And she hopes that her animal friends who live in the barn can tell her on Christmas Eve who her true love is, so she can find him, get married before it's too late. So that's the story. And in the section that I'm going to read to you, chapter 3, she's Grace. Grace is the young woman. Grace is doing an apple peel ritual to find out the letters of the name of her beloved, her intended. And this is a real thing.
Yes, I remember when we were kids, we did that.
Right. So she's doing this, trying to find out what the letters of her beloved's name are. Okay. Chapter 3, in which Lady Grace performs the apple peel ritual. September. It was a crisp fall day. Grace sat at the wooden table in the kitchen, a basket of Ashmead's kernel apples from the orchard in front of her. She methodically worked the fruit so that the golden brown peel stayed in one piece. As she cut into the cream-colored flesh of the fruit, a tart, citrus-like aroma was released. A pile of peels sat discarded next to her. She performed this ritual every month. When you're finished, I'll use the apples and the peels for a crumble, Mrs. Beaton said to Grace, leaning forward to take the completely peeled fruit from the girl's hand. Grace retained the apple peel, peering at it thoughtfully. I suppose that this is as good a peel as I'm going to produce, she said. Then go on with your ritual, sighed Mrs. Beaton, a resigned smile on her lightly lined face. Don't know as it will give you any better results than the last 100 times you performed it. Grace laughed. I haven't done this ritual 100 times, she protested, but I must find my true love. I'm almost 18. I'm positively ancient if I don't find anyone soon, and no one will want to marry me. Grace laid the apple peel on the table in front of her, taking time to make sure she didn't break it. She stood up, turned to her right 3 times, and then to the left 3 times. As she did so, she repeated a chant of her own creation. Spirit of the apple tree, here I twirl for all to see. Take this peel, O spirit above, Let it tell me of my love. As she said the word love, Grace picked up the apple peel between two fingers and threw it over her right shoulder. She stood still, counting silently to 5. She turned in place and looked down at the floor where the peel had landed. Everyone in the Wye Valley knew that if you threw an unbroken apple peel over your right shoulder, it might take the shape of the letter of the name of the person you were destined to marry. Mrs. Beaton, she called, please come and help me. What letter do you think this is? Mrs. Beaton took a slow step toward the apple peel and studied it. Well, she said, it's hard to say. You always say that, objected Grace. Well, dearie, said Mrs. Beaton, 'tis always true. But let's take a better look, she said, as she bent closer to the kitchen floor. Do you think it might be an L, asked Grace, or perhaps a P? An L or a P are both possible, replied Mrs. Beaton. You always agree with me, Grace protested. Perhaps we both see things the same way, said Mrs. Beaton with a smile. They both stood up. Grace picked up the peel and walked over to put it in the scraps bucket. Then she turned to her friend. How am I ever going to find my own true love, she sighed. I never go anywhere except to church on Sunday. I never meet anyone new. There is no one suitable for me in the village. All the men are too young or too old. And even if someone came along, unless he was at least an earl, my trustees wouldn't approve of him. I should be having my come out this spring, but the trustees say that there isn't enough money. How am I going to find my true love? Mrs. Beaton sighed. Grace was such a good, sweet girl. Was there a way of thwarting the trustees' plans for her marriage? Grace sat down at the table. L might stand for Lionel, she said, or Leopold, even Lucifer, although I hope not. How could she ever love Lucifer? He could stand for Percival or Paul, she continued. How will I know? There will be a winter fair in town soon, said Mrs. Beaton. People from other villages will be there. Perhaps you will meet someone there. Grace thought for a minute. When we go, I can listen to people speaking to one another, she said. Perhaps I will hear someone addressed as Lionel or Paul. If so, I will find a way to introduce myself, Grace said with a mischievous smile. We'll go together, my lamb, said Mrs. Beaton. Then it goes on.
Charming, absolutely charming.
Thank you.
How did you come up with the idea for Midnight Miracle? What was the genesis of the story?
When we were working on publishing Anarchy, Jim said to me, because Jim has lots of ideas of things that I should do. He said, you should write a short story for every holiday.
Oh.
And I said, that's a good idea. And we thought about when we could publish. And I said, well, how about I'll start with Christmas. And so I started thinking about Christmas stories, but I didn't want to write something really Christological. Because it narrows your audience. It has nothing to do with being a rabbi or Jewish, but Christmas is one of those holidays that if you're in the in-group, you're in the in-group, and if you're not, you're kind of looking around saying, what about me?
Right.
And so I started thinking about Christmas. First of all, Christmas at the beginning of the 1800s in England was not a big deal.
Right.
It wasn't until the Victorian period and and Dickens' Christmas Carol that you begin to have this impetus. As a matter of fact, there's a book about Dickens and a Christmas Carol, I think, called The Man Who Created Christmas.
Okay.
And interestingly, Charles Dickens in A Christmas Carol, that's kind of become, if you excuse the expression, my patron saint, because he had to self-publish it. Even though he was a published author, his publisher decided he didn't like the story, didn't want to publish it, and Dickens needed money, and he used the last of his money to publish it himself.
Oh, okay.
So it's such a great story. So Christmas in the early Regency period was not a big Christological thing. I mean, people went to church, and they might give presents, but nothing big. And Boxing Day was the day after Christmas,
Yes.
was
Yes.
the big holiday when basically people who were wealthy gave presents to their servants
Mhm.
and handed out boxes of food and other things to other less fortunate. And Boxing Day is still a big deal. It's
Yeah.
celebrated differently, but so I thought, well, I'm writing in this period, the early 1800s, when Christmas isn't a big deal. So what are the Christmas traditions that I might work with? And in doing the research, I came across this story, which I had known because there was an episode of I Remember Mama. It's a full TV show about Norwegian family living in San Francisco. And they did an episode about the animals talking on Christmas Eve. And I looked it up, and there was also in the early 70s, there was ABC, I think, did an animated version of that. And I thought, well, this could work. What part would the animals play in a romance? And then I got this idea of this young girl trying to find true love.
Mhm.
And I placed her in the Wye Valley because that is the setting for my Ravenscroft series.
Ah.
And in the Ravenscroft series, there is a group of Roma who are a very important part of that storyline, gypsies, Roma,
Yes. Yeah.
likely. And there's a woman who's the head of their clan, Momia, who is a seer.
Ah.
And so I thought, well, I could bring Momia in, and she could be the one. She could tell her fortune. She could tell her about the animals. And so that's how the story began to develop.
Well, I have to ask, why Regency romances? I mean, there are so many periods. What is it about the Regency period that just drew you?
My parents were Anglophiles, and they were very much in love with anything Victorian.
Mm-hmm.
My father was the founder of the American Lewis Carroll Society, and and he collected Carroll. So I knew a lot about England and all things English in the Victorian period. And when I started reading romances seriously, which is in the early 2000s, I found that the Regency era was one in which change was beginning to happen. And that appealed to me. The Victorian era is already kind of almost post-industrial. You have the switch from building canals to they have railroads already, and they have electric lighting, and they have other things. But at the beginning, the first half of the 1800s in England, you go from a period where women are property, as they were in America. And some women like Mary Wollstonecraft writes The Vindication of the Rights of Women at the late 18th century, saying women should be educated the same way as men are educated, because they can give more to society if they're educated, and there's no reason not to. Basically, that's her thesis,
Yes.
which was radical. Women could not buy that book. They would have to go to special booksellers who would sell those books in brown paper wrappers from underneath the desk. They weren't even it was shocking. It was like the worst pornography. And women would hide those books from their husbands and get together for supposedly to sew together or have tea together, and they would talk about these books. So it was a time of great radicalization of women in kind of a very infancy stage. And I came to adulthood in the late 1960s and was very much affected by was radicalized and very much involved with the women's movement in the 70s. And so I really understood what those women were dealing with, and I loved reading about it. And in Regency romances especially, there's a switch from the heroine who gets saved by the hero to the heroine who saves the hero.
Oh, I like that.
And is especially in, I'd say, the last 15 years. You know, if you look at the romances from the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s, you still have this, you know, when is my true love going to come? He saves me, you know.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. But I like the idea that you would have these stories where the women had a little more backbone and they didn't always sit around waiting to be saved. And so I like that. Also, I should call out to another patron, a very important influence, Louise May Alcott.
Yes.
The Little Women was the first book that I remember my mother reading to me.
Oh.
And they named me after Jo, you know, the writer.
Okay.
Story. So that was always something that I had, you know, how we write our own life scripts. The idea of writing in the attic and scribbling away, it was just such a potent creative influence.
As long as you don't sell your hair at any point.
No. No, that I would not do, but I understood and really identified with that act. Not only that she, as it's portrayed, that she sold it to help her mother because her mother didn't have money, but it was a very radical thing. And it was such an anti-authoritarian thing to do because women's hair was their crowning glory. Same thing in the Regency period, but women in their hair. And but I thought, you know, this is a woman who hears a different drummer. And I always felt that way about myself. So that was very important to me.
Sure.
And so getting back to your question about why the Regency. So you have this radical feminism starting. You have in the writing itself, in the genre, some shift in how it's possible to write about women. And also it's fun to write about rich people who have problems. Reference Dallas, Falcon Crest, all these great old shows, you know, which are all, I mean, nobody writes those epic stories about really poor people because that, you know, we want to revel in the fact that people, first of all, we want to read about all the stuff they have. But also we want to be reminded that money is not everything. And that people are people, and that sometimes the answer to a problem is not throwing money at it, but by perhaps being introspective, by changing one's behavior, by turning a page and seeing the world in a different way.
Yeah. Well, talking about that to some extent, how much does research drive your writing? Because you are trying to immerse the reader in another world, another time.
Right. So I'm by inclination, I think, an academic. I taught college for a number of years, and of course, as a rabbi, you're teaching every week, all the time, and I always loved that, and I always loved the research. And I've been teaching a weekly sacred text study program for 10 years, where we read. It's an interfaith group, and we read the Hebrew Bible, we read the New Testament, we read other things, other ancient texts, and talk about it. And I just love that. So I love doing research. And what I found that I liked as I started reading in this particular genre was I liked the books that were historically accurate. To some reasonable extent, right? Sometimes you want to take a little liberty, but I like that. And I thought, well, if I'm going to write these books, I want to be as accurate as I can. So I do a couple of things. I have different groups that I work with online, and I belong to a number of organizations for romance writers and historical fiction writers. And so we're always talking about how do we find out how long does it take to go from here to here by on horseback? How long does it, right? Those kind of things. Because I think those details make the story come alive.
Yes.
And I get annoyed when I'm reading a book and they say, well, they went from here to there and then the next day. And I know you can't get from Cornwall to London in one day, in 1805, right? So I do that. Another thing that besides getting just details right, details about what the rooms look like and what people might say, is I'm very careful about my language. I'm not writing Jane Austen language because that's unreadable for a modern reader. But I'm very careful when I write a phrase that comes easily, like hole in the wall, for example. I might say, oh, it's a hole in the wall. I stop myself and I think, okay, we are now going to go and Google when this first came into the English language, and especially in England, because if it came into the language in 1850, I can't use that.
Right.
So I'm always doing that. I mean, that's, and I actually, a lot of people, when they write, will, make a little note and go on, but I don't do that because it's so easy to miss it going back that I always double check. I check myself as I'm writing it so that I make sure that I get it right. And sometimes I'm right that it's fine. And sometimes I'm not right that it's fine. And so I have to find something else to use.
Yeah.
And that's part of my brand, in that it's accurate. We just uploaded a glossary onto the website. The books that I write all have glossaries in the back, 5-6 words, not a lot, because more than that we don't need in the book, but all the words eventually will be up on the website.
Marvelous. And the website is nolasaintjames.com. Okay. Now, as a rabbi, you are, questions aren't just a path, they're the purpose of life. I mean, the ambiguity, uncertainty, it's what drives Judaic studies. And that is so much the opposite of what a romance novel is, because there are very specific conventions that readers expect that if you break them, they're going to be very upset with you. Well beyond at one point in the book, do they meet and their eyes meet? But then they're torn apart. That has to happen at a certain point. And of course, the ending is a given. No matter what happens, the ending is a given. The girl's going to get her guy. If you don't have that, it's not romance, it's some other kind of novel.
That's absolutely right. That's by definition, the Romance Writers of America, by definition, in order to join, as your books have to end with that, you have to have a happy ending. Now,
Wow.
that doesn't mean that it doesn't have to be a wedding, and it doesn't even have to be the man and the woman get together, but it has to in some way make the reader feel that it's a satisfying ending that you would want to
And
have.
yet in Judaic studies, we are never satisfied
No,
because it's you never come up with a definitive answer ever.
right.
And that's why my novels are I tend to make my novels very realistic that way. But I'm curious, living in these two parallel lives, two very creative parallel lives, do you ever feel some bleeding happening, crossing over with the questions and the conventions? And like, do you ever just want to throw the convention to the wind and make them question the world? And when you're working on your Judaic in your weekly study group, you ever want to just say, well, this is just the way it is, leave it alone? Do they influence each other in any way?
There's tremendous influence. It took me a while to see that it was happening. But when I first wrote The Curse of the Ravenscroft Brides, people who read it initially said, well, what is this? It's romance but there's fantasy, and how can you have both? And I didn't know, but I was writing romantasy, which is now the hot thing in romance. The Times just did an article about it. And it's basically a romance, but it has some aspect of fantasy.
Mm-hmm. So this handsome man turns into a raven is the fantasy of
it. That's what makes it the romantasy.
Okay.
But it also has a villain. It has this really evil, awful villain, and who's the stepfather of the heroine.
Of course, yes.
And at the end of the book, 100,000 words, and actually, before in the first draft was 140,000 words. Told me it was way too long, and I cut it. And, but I didn't want to kill him off because my rabbi self believes in redemption. So Jim and I had many conversations about this, and I found my way around it so that we could get rid of him, but he doesn't die.
Okay.
In the second book, in The Evil Earl's Revenge, he comes back, and he's even worse.
Oh.
And he has to be killed. And Jim and I, it was months. I'm writing this, and I'm saying, Jim, please, and he would say to me, he's too evil to be redeemed. He was. I knew it. I'm the writer. I knew he needed to die. It was so hard for me to write, to kill him off, even though he so much deserved it. And I think when people read the story, they will be cheering when he's finally killed. But a very funny thing happened. I killed him off. I wrote the scene. I called Jim and I said, he's dead. I didn't have to say anything else. He knew who I was talking about. And he said, congratulations. You go to sleep. The next morning, I wake up and I realize he's not dead. He told me that he had something that he demanded. It's not exactly that he demanded a recount, but he had his last dying words, and I didn't permit him to say his last dying words.
That's marvelous. That's so now the Ravencroft books are going to be published. The first one in January.
The second one.
I am assuming. Well, I did have one other question, and then I want to go into this. the Regency period, the historic Regency period, wasn't all rich Christians,
No.
Protestants.
Right.
There's a lot of marginal groups, including Jews,
Right.
in the Regency period. The novels very seldom have these people in them. Do you have any plans?
I've been trying to figure out how to write a Jewish Regency for years, because they weren't part of the aristocracy.
No.
And in the genre, it's about the aristocracy.
Ah.
So, and I feel very strongly that a writer has to respect her readers' expectations.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So, which is probably why there are writers who write under different names and they write different types of things. Like one of my favorite writers, Elizabeth Peters, who wrote a marvelous series about an Egyptian archaeologist named Amelia Peabody. Under a different name, wrote Gothics, American Gothic, current American Gothic novels under the name Barbara Michaels.
Okay.
And so she had, once she became Elizabeth Peters, which also wasn't her real name, she wrote this long series. I think it's 19 or 20 books, plus a lot of other stuff. She's very prolific, and she herself was an archaeologist. She was fascinating. Mm-hmm. If you haven't read Crocodile on a Sandbank, which is the first of the novels, it's really worth a read. It stands up to time, and it's, I think, one of the great heroines of modern fiction. But you have to,
mm-hmm.
your readers expect you to do certain things. If I could figure out a way to write a good story about Jews in England during the Regency period, mm-hmm. I would have to create an completely different world for them.
Yes.
And a different point of view. You know, and I haven't quite figured that out yet. I've written into a couple of books that will be coming out probably in 2026, some Jewish characters.
Oh, okay.
So they're not major characters, but I'm trying to I think it's my way of kind of working out how do we bring Jews in. And I have copious notes about characters and people who I would like to write in. But again, because they have to fit into the genre, mm-hmm. it's hard. It's hard. I would love to read good historical fiction about Jews. I have yet to read anything that's really has captured my attention.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, maybe that's going to be another.
I'm working on
a name for you. Jo David's a very nice pen name. Really, it would work out well.
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions for writers just starting out?
Yes, actually, thank you. I think the best way to write is to write.
Yeah.
You need to make the commitment that you're going to write every day and figure out a schedule so that you write every day. Even if you don't produce much, you mm-hmm. need to go and sit in front of your computer or however you write for whenever the time is that you've decided you're going to write. And mm-hmm. it has to be like going to a job.
Yes.
You have to sit down, and for those however many hours you think it should be. And I don't think for new writers, I don't think they should try to do more than an hour a mm-hmm. day, because that's long if you're just starting out. But if you spend an hour a day at the same time every day, you can take off the weekends if you want. But, just working at it, after a while, you begin to get it, you develop the muscles
Mhm.
to do it.
Yeah.
And just keep doing it. It's not the easiest thing in the world to write.
Not at all.
When it's right, it's the best thing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it is. And and I'm so delighted that you have made the commitment to doing it. And I know your readers are going to have so much fun with you
Oh,
as you keep producing these books.
thank you.
Congratulations, Nola,
Thank
for
you so much,
achieving
Sally.
this. My guest today was Regency romance author Nola Saint James, aka Jo David. Her newest books are Anarchy at Almack's, Rowan's Story, a story of love at first sight, which was published by Nemeton Press this past April. And the book that she read from is Midnight Miracle, a Regency Christmas romantasy, which came out just this August from Pinfeather Press. She has the Ravencroft books coming out in just a few months. You can connect with her at nolasaintjames.com, and Saint is spelled out fully. So it's NOLA saintjames.com, and on both Facebook and Instagram. As for me, my two newest books are A Being Woman, a collection of feminist science fiction tales from Noble Fusion Press, and Daughters of Eve from Bayit Publishing, which is an essay-based workbook and journaling guide exploring the nature of our lives today through the lens of the stories of the women from the Hebrew Bible. My website and blog are at SallyWienerGrotta.com. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and sometimes Blue Sky. And if you want to be among the first to read about some of my new adventures or appearances and books, and learn about other fascinating folks that I'm interviewing, please sign up for my newsletter on my, it's a very occasional newsletter, by the way. Don't worry about being spammed. I'm lucky to get it out every few months, but it's always interesting. And you can sign up for it on my website. Thank you for joining us. And thank you so much, Nola, for being with us.
So much, Sally. It was great. Really great.